Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. I'm Mike Swartnam, and it's my privilege to welcome one and all to the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. Once again, we have the privilege of being the host for a seminar today on some of the world's most topical and dangerous topics that anyone can address. And of course, we're holding this seminar on one of the most memorable or infamous days in the history of the United States, or in fact, in the world. It was 11 years ago that we sat in this conference room and watched on the big screen as the second plane went into the building, and then had even some of our employees show up and report while driving in, having an airplane fly very low over them into the Pentagon. And then we watched the horrible scenes for the rest of the day in this room. And as many now all take for granted, back then the early discussion was, first, this can't be an accident for a plane to fly into a building and then for a second plane to fly into the building next door. And who could have done such a thing to the United States? And being the home here at the Potomac Institute of the International Center for Terrorism Studies that Yona Alexander has led for so many years, it didn't take even the second plane going into the building before Yona and many of his workers reported that this had to be the work of not just enemy of the United States. This had to be the work of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. That it had all the fingerprints of an Al-Qaeda event, and that there wasn't any question, even before it was reported in the press, there wasn't any question here at the Potomac Institute that this was one more example of terrorism in the modern age. The terrorists using modern technology to threaten us in the age-old ways that they've tried to do for thousands and thousands of years. And it reminded those of us here at the Potomac Institute how important it was to be supporting the efforts of Yona Alexander and his many scholars who've been looking into these issues of terrorism for now going on 50 years. Yona's efforts have spearheaded and led, been an example for the academic study of terrorism around the world for almost 50 years. His efforts have not just identified those individuals and those groups who threaten the safety of the world, but he has in fact spearheaded the effort to profile those groups, profile their motivations and their actions and their processes in ways that have helped inform governments for decades. An example of that was before 9/11. Not 11 years ago on 9/11, but 12 years ago when Professor Alexander put together an effort here at the Potomac Institute to do a profile on Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda and publish a volume detailing not just the network, but in fact all those pictures that you saw became part of posters were actually pulled together, researched, and all the background done by Professor Alexander over a year before the event here in 9/11. And it's been my privilege to, working with him, to put together the anniversary volume that just came out on that same event as well. The important point there is to recognize, once again, the importance of looking at these events, the insidious people who are involved in these events from an academic way, with always a view towards what can we do to mitigate the effects of terrorism and limit its ability to hurt our democracy and the movement of mankind. So I wanted to kick this session off today with a very special note that not just remembering 9/11, but remembering those who died on 9/11 as we should always, but also recognizing and remembering those in academia at this table who have spent their lives studying these issues in an effort to help us figure out how to deal with it in a modern age in a way that moves us away from fear and towards progressive ways of preventing these types of things from happening again. So as you once again participate in a great venue put together by Professor Alexander join me in thanking him and his team and all the scholars around the world that he collaborates with in doing this type of work that is so vital in informing our policymakers on how to deal with these efforts. Professor, thank you for doing this. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Alexander for some opening remarks. Yes, we're going to, we want to take the opportunity as well to give a copy of our latest edition to each one of the speakers. If you allow me to do that even before they speak. Usually we make them speak and deliver on their goods before we give them something, but today I guess we gave you lunch to begin with. So.
Thank you very much.
Jonah, the microphone's yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mike. Some of my students asked me, since we were planning this event today, whether we're going to focus on Al-Qaeda on this anniversary date. And I said, well, we're going to focus on Syria and Iran. So they were surprised. But we certainly would have to refer to the Al-Qaeda in connection with Syria and Iran. As Mike noted, and we know very well, this is the 11th anniversary of 9/11. But let me remind all of us that basically we are engaged in a long war with Al-Qaeda, going back actually to 1996, which really makes it the 16th anniversary, when Al-Qaeda declared war against the United States, against the United States, and subsequently, as we know, 2 years later issued the fatwa directed against Americans, the so-called statement on the nuclear bomb of Islam, to prepare the people to attack or to use as much force as possible against the United States. So the reminder is that tragically, this is the longest war that the United States is engaged in the 20th century and the 21st century. Longer than World War I, longer than World War II, longer than the Korean War, longer than the Vietnam War, and also Afghanistan and Iraq. So the point I'm making is there is no way that we can discuss any of the challenges without also dealing with the challenge of Al-Qaeda. And the tragic, realistic, I think, conclusion is that we would have to deal with the challenge of Al-Qaeda for the remainder of the 21st century, because we're engaged also in the battle of ideas. In other words, the culture of life versus the culture of death. And it is a generational, I think, battle that we will have to deal with. And clearly, the relevance to the Al-Qaeda to our discussion today, we are going to discuss it, but at least in terms of the involvement of some operatives and some affiliates in the battle of Syria, those who come from Iraq or Jordan or Saudi Arabia, Libya, Egypt, and so forth. So I think fundamentally we'll have to reassess the strategy in light of the Arab Spring and what's happening in the region itself. Now, just one footnote on the academic work. related to the Middle East. Obviously, we have a very, very distinguished panel, and we do have some people in the audience who dealt with this issue for a long time. As academics, Mike mentioned half a century, it's correct. In terms of activities in the region, academic studies and seminars and conferences and courses, as well as publications in regard to the Middle East. I'd like to mention one particular publication which underscores, I think, the relationships with the region. Is a journal, it's a NATO journal called the Partnership for Peace that we're publishing together with the Center of the Partnership for Peace in Ankara, Turkey, dealing with specifically the challenges to the international community and what we can do about it. So again, we're involved in these activities as well as in second track so-called diplomacy, the question of the weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East, or the peace process, and so forth. We do have obviously a very rich panel that is going to deal with some of these issues. Particularly, I think what we like to focus on today relates to Syria and Iran. One can deal with the topic that we decided to use, inevitable last resort, Syria or Iran first. And since you have the bios of the speakers, I will not go into great details. I just want to mention some of the highlights. Our first panelist is Ambassador James Jeffrey, the former U.S. ambassador to Iraq and Turkey and Albania. And you will see from his bio that he has a very distinguished career, senior positions in the State Department, dealing with these issues as well. And he served in the region. And I would like to note that last Sunday, he had a very extraordinary op-ed article in the Washington Post, where some of you have seen that, related to the fictional war that is going on, if I may use that term. But basically, we see the exploitation of religion in political conflict. So again, I think we're going to discuss today not only the red lines, the famous red lines that is being repeated again and again, but also red lines in regard to the religious input or ecumenical red lines that we have to establish. Ambassador Jeffrey, please. Would you like to come here so it will be a little bit easier?
Thank you very much, Yuna. It's good to be here today. I just want to make a few introductory remarks following up on the initial introduction and move on to our other speakers, and I hope that we can have some time for questions and answers, because this is a very broad subject. And it was made even more broad by the introduction of Al-Qaeda, which is definitely a very important issue in Syria, not non-existent, but significantly less important in terms of the U.S. and the West and Iran, but an underlying problem, as he illustrated, for all of us in the policymaking and academic communities when we try to figure out the region. I would be even a little bit more historical than Professor Alexander was. David Christ just came out with a book on Iran, which he would have challenged the idea of our longest war is with Al-Qaeda since 1996. He believes that our longest war is the Twilight War with Iran since 1979. I just came back from Iraq, and I've been involved with possibly not a candidate for the longest war, but a very long war with Iraq, people in Iraq, ranging from the standpoint of the United States from 1990 until basically, we could say, the withdrawal of U.S. troops just a few months ago. And that isn't the end of the conflicts in the region. Something's going on here, folks. We all know this, we all deal with it every day, but we don't really try to put our finger on it because we focus on the individual problems. Al-Qaeda today, Iran yesterday, Marine barracks in Lebanon a few days before, turmoil in Yemen, northern Mali going south. This is not an Islamic problem. There are many Islamic countries with an Islamic population, Turkey, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Albania, who don't have this problem. It's not simply an Arab problem, because in this complex of seemingly constant conflicts and challenges to administrations from the 1960s on to today, obviously, you have not only Arab states, but you've got Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran, which are famously not Arab countries. It is a regional problem, but it is a very serious problem. When we talk about terrorism in the context, for example, of Al-Qaeda in the Middle East, it's very different than in another life I was involved with and was almost killed by the Baader-Meinhof RAF terrorists in Germany in the 1970s. That was a very different context. That was a problem, and in 1990, there was actually a whole series of assassinations of senior German officials by these guys who everybody thought had been finished a decade or more ago. They were a terrorist problem, a pure terrorist problem, in a otherwise very peaceful environment. Terrorism in the Middle East, not so much Al-Qaeda, I would say, but certainly as used by the Iranians and some of their friends, Hezbollah, by Hamas and others, is part of asymmetrical warfare, which is how a whole variety of actors, be it terrorism, be it popular uprisings, be it going for nuclear or other chemical or biological weapons, asymmetrical warfare that these countries and these forces and these leaders use to conduct operations against the rest of the region, the outside world, the international order, in a quest for hegemony or a quest to challenge others. So we're dealing with a very, very complicated, very, very crisis-prone part of the world. The administration announced, and for understandable geostrategic regions, a pivot towards the Pacific back at the beginning of the year. I'm pretty sure from my time in the government and my time following government operations since then that 80 or 90% of the serious meetings at the National Security Council principals or deputies levels in the West Wing have been focused on this larger region as opposed to crises with aircraft carriers and planes being ready to launch in the Pacific, because from my experience in working in the White House, the Pacific, while a long-term very important challenge to us, is not something that generates day in and day out drama. Believe me, the Middle East generates day in, day out drama. Well, the day in, day out drama we have right now is a dual drama, which is Syria and Iran. They're linked in several different ways. One is that Syria is obviously an ally of Iran's. Iran is extremely active in trying to support the Assad government. The Assad government, despite Iranian help, is under increasing pressure. Nobody can predict how this thing is going to turn out. The U.S. administration, particularly with the decision by Turkey this week to start pulling refugees back from the border and increasing the decibel level of its critiques of American and other countries' inaction in the face of Turkey bearing the burden, is faced with a decision on whether we go in more significantly. My concern, as I indicated the other day in the op-ed, is that there are major tendencies by both sides, by people in the Iranian, Syrian camp, and people among the Sunni Arabs in the region who are looking at this not through the eyes of a challenge to international order or Iranian hegemonic tendencies or oppression of a population, a majority of the population, by a dictatorial minority in Syria, but rather as a Shia-Sunni fissure split, and people are looking at this in sectarian ways. There, the Al-Qaeda site is very, very important. The hallmark of the Al-Qaeda in Iraq organization, to some degree in contrast and in opposition to the Al-Qaeda leadership in West Pakistan, was to see itself primarily as an anti-Shia movement. During my almost 2 years in Iraq, my last time there, we saw many Al-Qaeda attacks. None of them were against us, Americans, even though we're the sworn enemies of the al-Qaeda leadership, both before and after the administration took out bin Laden. Rather, the attacks were almost always against the Shia or occasionally against Sunnis who were supporting the government, which the al-Qaeda and Iraq people saw as a Shia government. So we have under the surface this religious issue, but we have, as I said, many other problems. In terms of how, from my standpoint, the administration is tackling this, it's clear that, particularly before the election, there's a reluctance to get more involved in Syria, particularly because you have the Iranian crisis looming. And we all know the elements of that. Israel is getting ever more concerned about the failure of diplomacy to reach a breakthrough despite several P5+1 meetings since the Istanbul meeting in the spring of this year. They in Israel are also very concerned about losing their military edge in the sense that eventually the Iranians will be able to bury much of their nuclear program infrastructure. So there's a lot of churn out there about what Israel is going to do. The administration in response has announced a new policy, not of containment or deterrence, but of prevention, in that President Obama was very explicit at the APEC conference, stating that he would use military force. He said that directly to prevent Iran from gaining nuclear weapons. The problem is, as the Israelis have pointed out, there is no specific red line. At what point do you determine that they are about to go across that line? What exactly is that line, and what are the indicators, and how do you explain that, how do you justify that? So there are a lot of unanswered questions concerning that, but it's clear that we are moving both on the Syrian front and on the Iranian front towards heightened tension and the very strong possibility, either in Syria or with Iran, of an expansion of this conflict and a melding together of this conflict throughout the region. So it's of great concern to everybody who's observing it. On the other hand, the United States has a strong position in the region right now. There is a very, very strong alliance that is growing stronger between the Gulf states and the U.S. It has a military angle, as we saw in the December GCC meeting that Secretary Clinton attended. We have a strong Turkish role in this as well. That is very, very important given Turkey's growing weight in the region, both economically and politically, but also militarily. We have a NATO angle with the recent decision to put a radar essentially aimed at deterring or blocking or shooting down Iranian missiles in Turkey to defend NATO countries. And of course, the increased U.S. cooperation with Israel in the ballistic missile defense front is very, very well known. So we're in a good position there. The United States has very, very strong military forces throughout the region. There are a few countries that do not allow us access and do not allow us considerable intelligence sharing. We are in a situation where the Iranians are under great international pressure. You can see that in the fall of the rial. You can see that in the dramatic decline in their oil exports. I think in this last month they fell just below 1 million barrels. Iraq's oil exports, which have balanced that to some degree, are up to 2.5 million barrels a day. And in addition, the Syrian situation obviously puts Iran under tremendous pressure. So it is another tool that we can use if we're willing to use it effectively to keep pressure on Iran. I'll stop there and turn it over to the rest of the panel.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Obviously, we'll come back to many of the points that you made. Our next speaker is Barbara Slavin. Currently, she's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council on South Asia Center. And as many of you know, she's a distinguished journalist. She actually was a reporter for USA Today, as well as the Washington Times, The Economist, and the New York Times. And only recently, I think about a week ago or so, she returned from Tehran. She made at least 7-8 trips to Iran. And she also interviewed the president of Iran at some point. And she also had the opportunity to serve as a scholar at the Wilson Center and the U.S. Institute of Peace. And she wrote a very distinguished book, Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran, the United States, the Twisted Path to Confrontation. Baba?
Thank you very much. You finally got me here after many years of asking, so thank you, Yona. I wrote a very nice speech, but my computer seems to have died, so I'm going to have to wing it. I'm not going to talk directly about the premise of war at this point. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of U.S. relations with Iran. I just got back from my 8th visit to Tehran. And I was thinking, given it's 9/11 and so on, about a visit that I took there in December 2001, and where we were then vis-a-vis Iran and where we are now. And it's unfortunately not a very pretty picture. Back in December 2001, I think I got the warmest reception in Iran that I'd ever gotten. People there, you must remember, were the only ones in the Middle East to spontaneously demonstrate in support of the United States after 9/11. And government officials and others, people who had been reluctant to speak about restoring relations with the United States in December 2001 were very eager to talk about that. Even so-called hardliners were muting their criticism of the United States. At that time, of course, we were on the same side against the Taliban in Afghanistan. Iran helped us there, helped to set up the Karzai government. And there was a great deal of optimism that 9/11 would be a game changer in terms of the curse of U.S.-Iran relations, if you will. I wrote a story for USA Today that was entitled, "America, No Longer a Dirty Word in Iran." And I referred to the fact that people were having Coca-Cola with their kebabs. The real thing had just come back to Iran. A bottling plant had started up in Mashhad that was actually making real Coca-Cola for the first time since the revolution. It was a great trip. I just got back from another week in Tehran, and it's, you know, the city in some ways looks a lot better. They poured a lot of resources into making it look good for the Non-Aligned Summit that recently happened. But the people are so demoralized, and where Iranians used to be extremely welcoming toward foreigners, particularly Westerners, they would approach you on the street to practice their English, to greet you, to tell you about people they know who lived in the United States, that sort of thing. Now people keep their distance. And I think they do this for two reasons. One, of course, is the security presence is much more extensive than it was a decade ago. This is a legacy of the 2009 elections and the protests that followed, which were, of course, put down very forcefully by the government. But there's also a change in attitude toward the West, and I think this is something we have to be concerned about. The sanctions which we have imposed, our Congress does not want us to go to war, so instead what do? They pass sanction after sanction after sanction, and sometimes the Obama administration embraces this, sometimes not. They're sort of put in a position where they have to accept these sanctions because they're passed 100-1 by the Senate. These sanctions are no longer smart. They have become dumb. They are no longer targeted. They are no longer surgical. They are now hitting the ordinary people of the country in an unprecedented way. And while Iranians blame their own government for mismanagement, corruption, and so on, they're beginning to blame us for these sanctions. And this is something we need to be aware of. We talk about military action. I think that would have a disastrous impact in terms of rallying the Iranian people around their government, not around us. That's for sure. But already we have sanctions that are in effect the moral equivalent of war. There are people who are dying because they cannot get blood plasma, if they're hemophiliacs, because they can't get enough IVs for some patients. European pharmaceutical companies will not sell pharmaceuticals to Iran anymore because they don't know how they would get paid, and there has been such an intense name and shame effort in this country by some organizations that basically no Western companies want to have anything to do with Iran anymore. This is very troubling, even though our regulations permit humanitarian transfers, food, medicine, and so on. fewer and fewer companies are willing to actually undertake this sort of trade. So I think these are some things that we have to keep in mind as we talk about issues of war and peace in the region, and particularly as we talk about Iran. A few brief words on Syria. The Iranian officials I spoke to, and I interviewed Ali Salehi, the foreign minister, and Ali Larijani, the speaker of the parliament and the former nuclear negotiator. And both were very, very hardline on the question of Syria. The Iranian line, and I think to some extent they believe it, is that the Syrian opposition, if it's not now, will soon be completely taken over by Salafists and jihadists, and that these people do not have the best interests of the West at heart, and we will be sorry, like we were sorry about supporting the Taliban and the precursors to the Taliban in Afghanistan, because these people, when and if they take power, will not be pro-Western at all. This is the line they're pushing. Obviously, they have a vested interest in presenting themselves as the enlightened alternative to these characters. But, you know, they've had long and sad experience with these groups, and while they have had, at times, a marriage of convenience with some elements of al-Qaeda, it's never been a marriage of love, and they're already preparing themselves for the Taliban taking over again in Afghanistan. One of the people I spoke with said, well, once the Americans leave, first they'll take the East, then they'll take the South, and then we'll have to deal with it, i.e. they'll have to support a Northern Alliance sort of grouping again to try to maintain Iranian influence in Western Afghanistan. And he suggested that the U.S. would then see the light and realize that it needed a better relationship with Iran in order to fight these suicidal fundamentalist Sunni terrorists. So what you see depends on where you sit, and the view from Tehran is very different from the view here in Washington. You know, I'd like to say that I think U.S. policy is going in the right direction. I don't think it is. I think we're being bludgeoned and bullied by the Israelis and pushed in a direction which will not be good for us, which will not be good for Israel, which will not be good for the region, certainly will not be good for the global economy. So I understand the Israeli concerns, but, you know, I think they're whipping themselves into a hysteria, and they're contemplating actions that could really be self-defeating in the future. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Obviously, we will have, as I said before, the discussion and many of the points you made will basically try to expand the discussion not only in regard to the U.S. role, but even lately Canada's decision to cut off relations with Iran and other countries as well. Our next speaker is Ambassador Theodore Katouf, also has very, very distinguished background diplomatically, ambassador to Syria and the UAE, and as well as serving in many countries in the Middle East, diplomatic posts. And in addition to that, he had the opportunity to be a fellow at Princeton University, and currently is the president and CEO of a Mid-East consulting group. Ambassador Katouf, please.
Thank you, Dr. Alexander. I was in the Foreign Service for 31 years, but for the last 9 years I've headed Amid-East, a nonprofit, non-governmental organization that does education, capacity building, exchange programs throughout the Middle East and North Africa. So I go to the region often, but I go more these days to talk to ministers of education, higher education, social affairs, and labor, rather than foreign ministers and the like. With that caveat, let me say that my 21 years of living in the Middle East and almost 7 years of living in Syria have convinced me that the law of unintended consequences is almost constitutional writ in the Middle East, and that you always need to be humble and you always need to keep that in mind. I think where Syria is concerned, and that's where I'm going to focus because I don't deal with Iran, I think most of us could agree on several broad, generalized judgments. The Assad regime is obviously desperately clinging to power, regardless of the costs to the Syrian people or the country as a whole. Indeed, it has seemed to do its best to turn this into a sectarian civil war, not just a civil war, with the Alawites being an offshoot, of course, of Shia Islam, and the majority of the country being Sunni Arab. This regime is not interested in fundamentally reforming itself under any circumstances because it knows that it could not stay in power under different circumstances. The regime can still count on a number of overlapping intelligence and security units, as can they, the bulk of the armed forces, because most of the officer corps and even the professional non-commissioned officers are Alawites or are people who are beholden to the regime. Most of the populace is being forced to choose sides, and usually they're choosing sides on the basis of sectarian or ethnic identities, because you do have almost 10% of the population that's Kurdish, generally living in the northeastern part of the country. But we have to keep in mind that there are significant minorities in Syria, and many of them are on the fence or actually rooting for the regime, as bad as it is, to prevail. And here I'm talking about the Druze, Christian, and Shia minorities, and even some urban, sophisticated Sunnis who have benefited financially and otherwise from this regime, and fears what they regard as the rabble out there that's trying to overthrow the regime. The opposition, and let's be honest, we don't know it well. I certainly don't know it well. But it's politically disparate. And those Syrians outside the country who purport to represent the opposition are not really fully in touch with the local Syrian committees that on a day-to-day basis are responsible for internal resistance and increasingly effective guerrilla and overt warfare against the Assad regime. Across the region, as we know, sectarian tensions are rising almost everywhere in the Arab East. And in Syria, much like occurred in Iraq, sects are starting to sort themselves out by neighborhood and village and the like. The economy in Syria is at a dreadful state, and not least because of severe Western sanctions that have been applied against it. But as usual, the elite will be just fine. It's the ordinary people who are bearing the greatest brunt of the suffering and deprivation. There are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of refugees. We have to keep in mind that even before March 2011, when the uprising began, the resistance began, Syria was experiencing terrible drought in the breadbasket of the country along the Euphrates, and those dry lands out there near the Iraq border. And indeed, that may have hastened the uprising in Syria, just the falling of living standards and the hopelessness that a lot of Syrians felt. But as we've seen in recent weeks, neighbors such as Turkey and Jordan are starting to feel overwhelmed by the refugee problem, and there are many more internal refugees, I suspect, than there are those who've managed to cross the border. And I would also posit that both sides, both the opposition and the regime, particularly the Alawites, regard this as an existential struggle. and there is no lack of will on either side to continue this fight as long as they possibly have the means to do so. So I do not see this coming to an end, not even if the Assads were to go into exile or be killed. I think the Alawites will continue to fight on. They may not be able to control the entire country, and indeed it's becoming quite clear that even now they can't control the entire country. They can retake a village or they can retake an urban area if they bring a lot of firepower to bear, but they can't continue to hold it, and once they withdraw, the opposition comes right back. Obviously, Russia is the international key to breaking the stalemate that's occurring in Syria, but they feel humiliated by perceived past foreign policy setbacks in places such as Libya, where they felt the West took advantage of a UN Security Council resolution, and earlier in the 1990s in Kosovo. So now they're determined to block any UN Security Council resolution with enforcement mechanisms in the resolution. And they seem more than willing to, as short-sighted as it seems to us, to maintain this position. And indeed, I think U.S. diplomats and others have tried to find out what's the price of Russian support, and they can't. There doesn't seem to be any price right now that can buy a change in Russian policy. As I said at the beginning, I believe in the law of unintended consequences, which means I'm not in favor of a robust U.S. military posture. We've been at war in that region for 11 years. I think the U.S. public, it's safe to say, has had it with U.S. troops being sent to the Middle East, and indeed we have worn out much of the U.S. military with constant deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. So unlike some who have clear policy prescriptions for the U.S. and the administration to end Assad's rule and to deal with Iran and Hezbollah, I have mostly questions that I don't think have, for which there are any easy or clear answers. For instance, if we remove the Assad family, what is the end game? What do we expect to happen there? Who do we expect to emerge? Will those oppositionists who ultimately come to power be people that we want to deal with? As I said, Sunni-Shia tensions are at almost at an all-time high and growing increasingly worse. If the Alawites are defeated, as bad and brutal as they are, who stops the massacres on the day after the Alawites fall? Who's going to put their troops in there, etc.? So in other words, let's say if the U.S. were to do in Syria what we did in Libya and effectively become the air force for the opposition, NATO, I shouldn't say the U.S., NATO become the air force for the opposition, and we largely render the Syrian armed forces as ineffective, are we going to be responsible then for massacres, counter-massacres, and brutalities that inevitably are going to occur? And then there's, of course, the whole question of who's going to get stuck with the bill for rebuilding Syria. That's perhaps the least of our concerns. And if we go in a robust fashion without a UN Security Council resolution that authorizes it under Chapter 7, what's Russia going to do? Maybe they won't confront us directly in Syria or the Eastern Mediterranean, but I recall that when Pakistan closed roads to us, we were dependent on Russia for a lot of our resupply in Afghanistan. We might remember that about this time in 2008, when there was a presidential election underway between McCain and Obama, the Russians were mucking around in Georgia, and now there's autonomous areas of Abkhazia and I can't remember what's the other minority group there, but the Abkhazians and the like. If we take the position that anything goes, how will the Russians react elsewhere? How about the Chinese with the Uyghurs and Tibet? A lot of implications for unilaterally going outside the UN to use force. So my strong sense is that the administration has been correct to be cautious, not to get involved directly in the arms supply business. God knows there's enough countries willing to help the opposition in that area. And we now will have to start worrying about man pads and civilian aircraft. So I want to see the Assad regime fall. I'd like to see the Syrian army break with Assad and to see us be able to broker some sort of negotiations between the opposition and senior military officers who are not as bloodthirsty as the Assads. But frankly, I don't hold out much hope for that to happen. My sense is that military intervention at this time would only be justified if we think that chemical and biological weapons are A, being used by the regime, or B, likely to fall into the hands of Salafists and other oppositions.
Before we open discussion, I would like to ask General Al Gray perhaps to make some preliminary remarks and then final remarks. Would you like to come here?
Not particularly, no.
Okay.
Not after this august group and their presentation.
Just some remarks at this point.
Yeah, I'll just make a couple right now and then maybe some at the end. I think it's been, thank you all for a most enlightening discussion. And these topics obviously are very, very complex, and there aren't any simple solutions, as everybody knows. First of all, we're dealing in large part with a religious type of situation throughout the Mideast and that part of the world that we've been talking about, and that in itself is very, very difficult. Secondly, we're dealing with people that many groups, both the minority and majority type groups, whether they're Christian or Muslim or Shia or Sunni or whatever, but many, particularly the minority groups, are afraid. They fear for what's going on, particularly right now in Syria and places like that, and that has to be taken into account. Historically, it's always been very dangerous to get too much involved, particularly for great powers and empires and all that, to get too much involved in the Mideast. Some historians have said it's the graveyard of empires when they do that. And there are a lot of cultural and multifaceted religious and other kinds of considerations here that have to be taken into account. And I quite agree with what I think was unanimous by the group, that military intervention is not necessarily the answer. We should be very, very careful about this. We have to make sure that somehow the United States, our allies, our friends, the free world as you know it today, that they in fact have a clear-cut policy together on this situation. And that is very complex and very difficult, if not impossible to do. You have to take into account the consequences of your actions before you take them. And we don't do that very well as a nation or a people. We are not good at looking at these countries and regions and peoples and cultures and norms through their eyes. We kind of focus with our eyes, and that's the wrong way to go about it. Let me tell you that firsthand. My simple example, I've used it here before, has nothing to do with the Mideast, but when I was on active duty every year, as many will recall, we'd have a flap in Haiti. And every year we'd go to sea and steam around in ever diminishing circles and consider what we would do about Haiti. And every year some Phi Beta Kappa in the Joint Chiefs of Staff would announce that we were going to drop leaflets. And every year we would send a simple message back saying that's a great idea, but they can't read. I mean, that's the point I want to make here, that you simply don't, you have to understand these cultures, these regions, these people, and everything you do in one part of the world, not just the Mideast now, because of global economic interdependence and all that. Everything you do is going to have some kind of impact elsewhere, and we have to be prepared to deal with that as well. And it's not just in the Mideast, where if we eliminate the Alawites and all that kind of thing, and what happens? What are the consequences? Nobody has mentioned, surprisingly, what's going to happen in Lebanon. Lebanon is a tinderbox. Lebanon is going to pay the price here, no matter who wins. And within Lebanon and within the government there and all of that, you've got my friends Hezbollah, who in many ways are the most dangerous group in the world, because they not only are terrorists, they're not only linked up with the radical part of Iran and all that kind of thing, and have caused much trouble, but they're very, very intelligent. They're very well educated, they're very good with money and manipulating money, and they're all over Latin America and elsewhere in the drug cartel business and all that kind of thing. So these are just some of the things that could pop up, and I could talk the rest of the day about many more, but I'll stop.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, first we'll ask the panelists if you want to make some remarks now. No? Okay.
Sure. Just in response to my other three panelists, I would take one disagreement. I feel bad about this because much of my foreign service career, and even when I was in the military, was devoted to trying to figure out what local people thought, and putting myself in their shoes and learning their languages and their cultures and trying to apply that to foreign policy. And then in my various jobs, first of all, I've seen a fair amount of war firsthand, and I've had roles in taking decisions, and by and large, I think those who watch me know that I'm very, very cautious, and I would agree with folks here that you better look before you leap, and you better be damn careful, and you better not have optimistic scenarios. So thus, you're probably saying, why is he taking up our time saying he's disagreeing with the other three? And I'll tell you why, folks. Because unintended consequences exist all the time. We defeated Germany and Japan, and what did we do? We opened the door for Soviet, communist, military, and ideological presence all the way to northern Japan and to halfway through Germany. That's the nature of things. So when people say, oh, gee, when we took down Saddam Hussein, we opened the door to a more powerful Iran. That's true. That doesn't mean it wasn't a bad idea taking down Saddam Hussein. It wasn't a bad idea driving the Russians out of Afghanistan. It wasn't a bad idea driving al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan 20 years later. Those were necessary things. They were necessary things because they were threats, and they were necessary things because they were clear and present dangers to an international order that we largely manage and lead with a lot of help from other people around the world. It's a very messy order. It makes a lot of blunders. We make a lot of blunders. But ultimately, if we're not out there sooner or later at some point deciding we got to push a button, we got to send troops in, we've got to do something, this international order slowly will fray at the edges and then go away. There are people who say, well, we're beyond that now. The international community is more mature. I don't see it. And I can cite Tom Friedman in Jordan a few months ago when someone asked him that. He was basically asserting that the American influence is fading because of globalization and the rise of the rest. And a lady from the audience asked him, gee, why is that a bad thing? And Friedman was horrified, and he went on at great length along the lines I'm trying to do here. It is very important that the United States act. It is very important that we act in a way that we minimize the downside risks, but we're always going to create a messy situation because it's a messy world. And therefore, you cannot allow that to drive your policies. You just have to let it inform your policies. So I'll stop there.
Okay.
Well, if that's directed at least partly toward me, I'm not arguing for a lack of American leadership. I'm arguing for a different kind of American leadership that doesn't see war as a solution or military intervention as a solution to all our problems. I would like to see a completely retooled U.S. diplomatic strategy toward Iran. I think, Obama started well and then gave up, and now we're sort of going down the same sort of road that George W. Bush would have followed, and I'm not sure what end in sight, and I'm hoping that after our elections we will see some more creative diplomacy on the part of the Obama administration or the new Romney administration, because I don't think that just simply telling Iran, you have to stop your entire uranium enrichment program, we don't want to talk to you about Syria, slapping more sanctions and more sanctions on them is really going to get us to where we want to go. So I want American leadership. The question is what kind of leadership, what kinds of tactics do we use?
Okay.
I would just endorse. I mean, I understand Ambassador Jeffrey's point. We can't abdicate leadership, but it's that old metaphor when you think the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Okay, we'll come back now. Yes, please.
Yeah, my name is Richard Dawson.
Speak louder, please.
Do you have a microphone?
No, okay.
Okay, we'll speak louder. My name is Richard Dawson of Dawson Associates. I'm very impressed by all the commentaries of the panelists. I want to make all of them the following question. What do you think about Al-Qaeda being the leader of the rebels against Assad in Syria and being supported by all the Western countries? For me, it looks like a contradiction that we are supporting Al-Qaeda in this mission. I would like to know what the panel thinks about that.
Well, as I said, I'm not working inside the bowels of the U.S. government and trying to make these assessments. I'm sure there are a lot of talented people right now who are trying to figure this out. But I think people have been correct. Some of the people who argue for U.S. Military intervention, that one of their strong arguments they make is the longer this drags on, the more the legitimate opposition, if you will, is going to be eclipsed by better armed, better trained, better financed radical elements. What we call Al-Qaeda and what we call Salafi. There's sometimes it's a distinction without a difference, but the fact of the matter is there is a danger that the longer this drags on, that the more radicalized the opposition becomes, and the more likely you are to get either a warlord kind of situation in Syria, essentially a failed state that looks more like maybe Afghanistan before the Taliban, although Syria is a much more sophisticated and developed society. Or you get even a worse. You get all of a sudden a radical Islamist regime in what used to be called the beating heart of Arabism, Damascus.
Okay, please.
My name is Charles Dahan. I'm with the World Federation of Moroccan Jews. We are a little bit farther than the Middle East. We're in an election year, and I do appreciate all the panel and everything, all the information that you have given us. The one thing that you did not mention, and I know Obama did a good job in the beginning with Iran, but Iran has done everything on the other end, threatening to destroy Israel, sending terrorists all over the world. Terror from Iran started in Lebanon, in Beirut, during the Reagan administration. And it's been documented that Iran has been a state sponsor of terrorism. We have not talked about that. Iranians are not bad people. Their leadership is bad. So we cannot blame America for the situation they are in today. This is what the government has brought the country, in that situation. I don't think America should be blamed. Now, there is another factor right here. For 4 years, there was the pressure of stopping Iran from getting closer to the nuclear bomb. today in the paper they were talking that they are within weeks, maybe even before the election. And the question is, Romney, as much as Obama has said they will be willing to intervene, but something is going to happen probably before the election, and how is that going to affect the election in this country?
Well, a couple of things in there. First of all, I don't think Iran will get the bomb before our election. My interpretation of the way they proceeded is that they are benefiting a great deal from having a nuclear program, but they understand that once they cross that line, it could be very difficult for them. They don't want to start an arms race, a nuclear arms race in the region. They don't want to be forced out of the NPT. They just made a big show of having a non-aligned summit where they proclaimed the right of every country to the peaceful use of nuclear energy. So they would be shown to have been lying, to have been hypocrites if they actually go forward and produce a weapon. You mentioned their threats toward Israel. Well, you don't mention Israel's threats toward Iran. Every Iranian I met asked me, is Israel going to bomb us tomorrow? The Israelis have been threatening to attack that country with, I would say, even more regularity than
For good reason.
Than Iran has been threatening to. I'm trying
They
to
want to
explain how
eliminate Israel.
I'm trying to explain how it looks from the Iranian point of view. Okay, not just from the other point of view with which we are very familiar. People are very worried that Israel will attack them, and they note that a lot of countries have nuclear weapons and pay no price, and Iran has no nuclear weapons and is paying a huge price already in the form of sanctions and UN Security Council resolutions. You say don't blame the U.S. government. I don't blame the U.S. government for Iran's behavior, but I do criticize my own government for not having policies that are perhaps as well tailored as they could be to achieve the result that we would all like to see. So I think if we're going to solve this problem, we do have to understand the other side. We can't just look at it from one side. And my own sense is that we will not have a crisis before our election. I think that the Obama administration has told the Israelis every which way it possibly can. And just last week, General Dempsey said that the U.S. would not be complicit in an Israeli attack on Iran. How more, I mean, we've told them no. We've told them we will not come to your aid if you start this. We've told them there's time, that Iran has not yet, as far as we know, made a decision to produce a weapon. While they have been doing, obviously, some R&D, it appears, they have not physically tried to build or test a nuclear weapon. So I think we should be careful about getting all hysterical about this. I think we have far bigger problems in the world right now than whether Iran does or doesn't go toward a nuclear weapon.
I don't advocate the war.
Yeah, and the war certainly is not. If we attack,
I'm just giving you the fact.
If we go toward military action, what happens then? Iran leaves the NPT. It says, well, we've been attacked. We absolutely have to have nuclear weapons to defend ourselves, and they speed up, their efforts to reconstitute the program to make a nuclear weapon. So I don't see that a military attack is going to achieve the stated goal. What we do know will happen is that there will be retaliation through terrorism, through direct strikes on Israel, on U.S. forces, on shipping in the Persian Gulf. We know the price of oil will jump, the price of gas will jump, and that our fragile economies will probably all go back into recession. Europe is already in recession. So this is, the second and third order effects, as the military likes to say, of actions have to be contemplated before we take them.
Okay, we'll have some other people. Professor Frieder, right there. Would you stand up so we can hear you?
My name is Gideon Frieder. I am not a policy expert. I am what's called an egghead, a scientist and an engineer. Panelists are usually selected because they are experts and because they have strong opinions. And sometimes they are a bit biased, and that's fine. That's why we need them, so we can see the opinions sometimes go to the extreme. The Slavian thing is very biased, in a good way. I think that saying that Iranians were the only people who were demonstrating in favor of the United States after 9/11 is wrong. The Israelis did as well. They also have a monument for 9/11. I don't think that Tehran has. Just a side.
Yeah, the Palestinians, as I recall, demonstrated a
But
support of Al-Qaeda.
I really don't take an issue in it. It's not really very important. It just shows certain bias.
including the idea that Iranians do not threaten Israel. I don't think that Ahmadinejad will agree with it. He threatened to wipe out the cancer. He threatened to wipe it out by weapons, and he said that he's ready to lose 30 million Iranians.
No, he didn't say that. Where did Ahmadinejad say he was prepared to lose
Not
30
to me.
million Iranians?
Not to me, but it was published in the American newspapers. If you want me to find out the reference,
I would love you to
I
find
shall.
that reference. I don't believe that he ever said such a thing.
Well,
Many times.
many times.
30 million Iranians he's prepared to lose. Can I tell you a few things about Ahmadinejad?
Just a second.
Is there a question in here besides if he's biased?
Yeah.
You know, we would like to expand the discussion.
Right.
So
We'll
just,
do it.
I know that
But-
you're an
but the
academic,
What's the
but
question?
The point is that using words like Israelis are whipping hysteria after their own history of being threatened and eliminated is not illuminating the problem in the right way. I don't think they are whipping out hysteria. They are very, very concerned because they are essentially in an existential danger. First time in the history of Israel, they were never in existential danger. Now they are. So if you call it hysteria, fine, but I don't think it is.
Okay, well, you're
Okay,
certainly
thank
entitled,
you.
certainly
Go
entitled
ahead.
to your opinion. In terms of Ahmadinejad and his famous wife, Israel Altana, what he has said, quoting Ayatollah Khomeini, who said it first and said it many times, was that that Israel would be wiped from the pages of history, which is not the same thing as saying that Iran will attack Israel and destroy it. The Iranian view is that the Israeli state is based on discrimination against the Palestinians and that therefore it will not in the long term survive. And I would argue to you that the biggest threats to Israel come now from within rather than from without, and that that's one of the reasons that Bibi Netanyahu likes to focus so much on Iran, because he doesn't want to deal with the problems in Israel's own society in terms of the growing Arab population, the growing ultra-Orthodox population, and all the many divisions there, as well as the issue of the changing nature of the countries around Israel, which are now much more populist and are not going to be willing to stand for some of the kinds of Israeli activities that, for example, Mubarak was very happy to condone in the past. So I think Israel makes a mistake by focusing so much on Iran. One other word about Ahmadinejad. He is the lamest of lame ducks now. He has zero power. Decisions are not made by him, they're made by the supreme leader. And Ahmadinejad is the fourth of 7 children. He is very unattractive. He didn't get enough love as a child, and he loves to attract attention. He doesn't care if it's good attention or it's bad attention. And this is why he loves to say things that drive eggheads like you crazy.
Just a comment that I'm sure Professor Frieder is well aware of. But in Israel, there has been an almost unprecedented debate at the highest levels of the security establishment, not whether or not necessarily this is an existential threat, but whether attacking Iran might be more of an existential threat than not attacking Iran.
Sorry, I'm not advocating attacking Iran. I didn't say that, and I don't think that's the right thing to do. And you are right. Many Israelis in very, very high positions have the same view.
So it's been a fascinating debate.
yeah. Let's go on to some other, Evan.
My name is Evan Lund. I actually work with a professor. I have a kind of more regional question. Do you think that if Iran were to go and acquire a nuclear weapon, it would go and lead to more of a worldwide failure of non-proliferation? As in Saudi Arabia would feel compelled to get one, and Egypt and then further along. So pretty much stopping Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon or finding the ability to quickly get a nuclear weapon would lead to a more stable world in total. I mean, again, this is one of the first nations to try to attempt to get nuclear weapons since I believe Syria when they got struck by the Israelis, obviously not North Korea, but it seems to be much more important on a global stage, not necessarily on a regional or bilateral stage either. So I'm looking more for a broader context about what do you guys think would happen if Iran were to acquire a weapon, and if they did, you think the world would be a much dangerous place?
It's hard to predict that. I know people who believe that they have heard very, very senior folks in Saudi Arabia say that they'll go that route. That would be the most likely. Egypt and Turkey are other potential candidates, but who knows? The problem is, do you want to take that risk? Iran has obligations under the NPT. It's not me or the American government, it's the IAEA that is repeatedly, in the meeting again this week, coming to the conclusion that Iran is blatantly violating these various policies and requirements, and not allowing the IAEA to go into, for example, a military site where we think that up until 2003 they were doing militarization research and testing. So that's a reality that, you know, in looking at this, you don't know for sure. You cannot prove the case because it's a future contingency. It's just that it's a very, very bad thing if it happens, and so there is a general consensus, again, not just by us, but by a number of other countries, including China and Russia, who could have most of the sanctions that are, many of the sanctions that are really hurting the Iranians are voted on by the United Nations, including Russia and China, or at least they're not vetoing them. And so I think that there is a general international concern about this, and there's a reason for that, and we need to take that very seriously.
Okay. Mark Kraft.
One retired State Department counterterrorism office. Before that, I was a journalist. And Ted's comments about Syria reminded me of the when I was a journalist and also an editorial writer, it was much easier to criticize the governments. But when I was in the State Department, I found it much more difficult to find workable solutions. And Barbara, you said we're not, we should take a more diplomatic approach. But you know, the approaches by previous administration, Secretary Albright tried to reach out to the Iranians. Now we have a situation where it looks like the Iranians have stolen the ball in the negotiations, or continue to work behind the scenes. So do you really see any viable options? Setting aside the military option and taking issue with your description of sanctions, because the purpose of sanctions are not to inflict punishment on people, but and I've been involved in sanctions issues for a long time, as you know, is to try to prod the government to think twice. Now, during the Iraqi situation, Saddam Hussein made a big show about real being denied, etc. So I raised the question of if Iranians are really dying because they're not getting blood transfusions, to what extent that may be because the government of Iran is not willing to use the scarce currency for that instead of supplying weapons to Iran. So the sanctions may be a bit blunt, but I suggest it's too early to tell what's going on. And the other thing that also occurs to me as being skeptical is that, all right, you can parse the wording of what was said about threats to destroy Israel. But you know, perceptions are important. Israelis, and this is, I think, one reason why the Israelis, or some of them might be wrongly think it's a threat. Why do they keep reiterating the various format? You think if they're smart, they would lie.
Sure. Let me take the last one first. Iran is desperately trying to improve its image in the Arab world, on the Arab street. And as has been pointed out, they've really lost influence. The peak of their influence was probably in the summer of 2006 after the Hezbollah-Israel war, which Hezbollah claimed it won by simply not losing. Since that time, because of the growing sectarianism in the region, Iran has really been in a difficult situation, and Syria puts them in a terrible situation supporting this repressive regime. So by hammering on Israel, they think somehow they're going to make themselves popular again in the Arab street. I think most Arabs see through this. I think it's really not helping them anymore, but it does, of course, make Israelis very upset to hear these words said about them all the time. They don't understand why the Iranians are doing it. This is, by the way, not a sentiment that is generally felt in Iranian society. When I first went there, I discovered that Iranians were anti-Semitic. They hate Arabs. They don't hate Jews, by and large. They hate Arabs, which is why the Shah and Israel had such a good relationship for so many years. So I think it's propaganda, it's spin, and you have to not fall for it all the time. You can't be that gullible. In terms of sanctions, this is information that I get from people. After the recent earthquakes, a number of Iranian American organizations tried to send money and and medicine and so on. They couldn't find a single bank that would handle the transaction. This is a result of sanctions. It's not the government right now. This is because almost no banks in the world will have anything to do with Iran. So how do you arrange this kind of trade? It's a legitimate concern. And then in terms of diplomacy, I invite you all to come to the Atlantic Council on October 4th when I will unveil a new issue brief that we're putting out on Iran, which will have some very specific suggestions for what the U.S. and the P5+1 should do differently the next time that they meet. It's not just Iran that's been stonewalling. If you look at the offer that was made to the Iranians over the summer, they were offered no sanctions relief whatsoever in return for giving up 20% uranium enrichment, sending out the stockpile and closing the Fordo facility. They were offered no sanctions relief whatsoever. It was a really, it was not a very impressive offer. So there's bargaining going on, and they did not accept that offer. There's a question of whether sanctions will push them, into such a corner that they will. I'm not persuaded that that will happen yet with the government, and I think we do need to look at some other approaches.
Yeah, I'd like to ask just raise a rhetorical question, although if somebody wants to try to answer it, fine. But Pakistan, I believe, has something like 200 nuclear weapons and has acted very irresponsibly. Can anybody say A.Q. Khan, who now I think is pretty much out house arrest
He's going to run for
and
president.
running around, et cetera. So India faces this existential threat too. I mean, just like Israel, they have a large arsenal. You're shaking your head, Professor, but just like Israel, they have a large arsenal of nuclear weapons, but so does Pakistan. It's not theoretical in Pakistan's case. They have it. The Pakistani military seems to be getting every year more and more militant, Islamic, and the like. And I see that as a huge danger to regional and world peace. And it's sort of amazing to me how little copy that gets in the media compared with Iran, which is blustering and threatening and all. But, I never took Rafsanjani and that gang for being suicidal. They'll send the Basiji out to be suicidal against Iraq and all, but they've got their fortunes in Dubai and the like. So, I do think there is, I don't want to say hysteria, but there is,
It's hysteria.
there's angst that's perhaps beyond what is required.
That's not a rhetorical question, it's a very good point, but I'll try to answer it as someone who's wrestled with this myself. And the answer that you'll get, not just from the Israelis, but from many, and not just from the Bush administration, but from the Obama administration, is that Pakistan, the predictability of Pakistan, A.Q. Khan being the big exception, but the predictability of Pakistan generally is relatively good. Even, frankly, the predictability of North Korea in recent years has been good. The problem we have with Iran is there is at least the threat or the possibility that you're going to have an Iran that is similar, and actually North Korea is perhaps a good analogy, where they took out almost the entire South Korean cabinet with a bomb. As we know, recently they sunk a South Korean naval vessel. And there is a degree of irrationality about this that at the margins of the Iranian relationship with the outside world is troubling. I'm not talking about supporting Syria from a realpolitik point of view. That's an absolutely sensible thing to do. Trying to kill the Egyptian, rather the Saudi Arabian ambassador to Washington using Mexican drug guys in the middle of a crowded restaurant in Washington.
Where all the Arab elite go.
Yeah, is a highly irrational thing. So much so that many of us didn't believe it until we actually saw the evidence.
Now, remember that it was the Saudis who said that we had to cut off the head of the snake. Remember that that Iran has lost 5 nuclear and other scientists to assassins over the last few years, and there was an explosion that killed the head of their missile development program. Remember that the MEK is still wandering around trying to get itself off the terrorist list so it can go and kill more Iranians. So you know, I mean, you do have to see things in proportion. It's not as though they're not facing threats of their own.
Okay, I know people want to ask questions. I love to debate, so let me take these one after another. The MEK, an organization that I have no truck with and have dealt very closely with in Iraq, there's many things you can say against it. It's a cult. It's full of propaganda. It has a lot of people on its payroll. The one thing it hasn't done is killed any Iranians in a long time. It used to, just like it killed 6 Americans. But it has renounced violence. It certainly, its credibility, low as it is, believe me, higher than the Iranians. And I would say that in terms of the Saudis, simply saying that you're going to cut off the head of the snake. Hello, you spent much of the last hour defending equally wacky statements that the Iranians have made as, well, you got to understand them psychologically. You don't kill somebody because his government says
this plot was so harebrained. I know you say you've seen evidence and so on, but I still think that there was a lot less there than meets the eye. I don't think the Iranians seriously thought they were going to be able to kill the Saudi ambassador in the middle of Cafe Milano in Washington. I think this was, if you read the indictment, it was largely entrapment by a DEA informant who egged on this very bizarre Iranian failed used car dealer and kind of pushed him to find, you know, more and more bizarre ways to carry out various plots. So the chances that this plot ever would have been executed, I think, are next to zero.
The issue is not whether it would have been executed. I think it was a very low possibility. The fact was that very senior levels of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards were involved in it. They were messages back and forth. This is essentially as incontrovertible as there is out there in this world that we deal with on a daily basis. That is a very surprising thing because, once again, predictability is one of the things, as a former senior government official, you actually focus on. These guys are not predictable. The attack, I mean, and I understand that it's likely that they're going to retaliate for the killings of the scientists. But to take out tourists in Bulgaria is not a particularly legitimate way to do it. Not even if you can say, well, look, you know, we're going to kill Israelis or we're going to kill Jews because they killed Iranians. Fine. But what's troubling is the rest of the world is not going to see it that way. You know, while it would still be terrorism, you would find an Israeli, you know, weapons expert.
As you know, the Iranians are not as accomplished as the Mossad, so they went after soft targets, and I'm certainly not defending it. It was horrific. They tried to kill some Israeli diplomats in India and in Thailand, and they failed. And so this is what came after. I'm certainly not defending it.
But once again, it's the unpredictability of the...
No, I find it quite predictable. I mean, remember what happened in Argentina when all those Jews were killed. This was retaliation for the Israeli assassination of the head of Hezbollah in Lebanon in 1992, I believe, Moussawi. I mean, I find it quite predictable. We know very well how the Iranians react when they're attacked. They use terrorism, and let's call it what it is. It's absolutely terrorism. There's nothing surprising to me about it. I mean, what was surprising to me about the Saudi plot was that it was so outlandish and amateurish and harebrained that it was hard to associate it with the vaunted Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is supposed to be somehow more professional than that. What I detect is that they are getting less good at what they do, which is something we should be glad about, I suppose. They're no longer quite as lethal as they were in the past, and they seem to be having problems getting proxies to do their dirty work for them in the way that they used to do in the past, which I think is interesting.
Okay. We have a few more questions. Dr. Raffaele, please. Speak louder so we can
Totally
hear.
with all time and what the field is running. I'm not tired. I'd like to make 3 points with regard to the comments by Ravan, which I think was somewhat pro-Iranian bias. One, the last minor comment, she said, how Iranians tried to accommodate Arab. They tried to invite Mohammed Morsi, the new president of Egypt.
Yes, I was there. I saw it.
They sent a delegation to make an effort against the wish of the United States to come to Iran. In his speech to the international non-aligned nations, they substituted the word Bahrain for Syria.
Yes.
So what kind of credibility one would attribute to Iran? Secondly, you seem to think that the sanctions are the major evils in Iranian economic problems. I was with the last World Bank Economic Mission to Iran in 1973. And I've been to Iran a number of times. In fact, I was born and raised in Basra, Iraq, and all the regions very well. The dysfunctioning Iranian economy did not start with the sanctions. It started with Khomeini. He nationalized the bank, nationalized corporations, and he created all kinds of economic organizations, particularly the Revolutionary Guard, which are now controlling the Iranian economy. And I think when we talk about sanctions, we have to take into consideration the misguided policies of the Iranian leadership. And third, it's true that Israel has been vocal with regard to Iran, but let's not forget there's a very silent opponent of Iran, Saudi Arabia, which carries a very strong weight in the United States. It is no less silently vocal, if I may use that term, in the United States and Israel. And not just Saudi Arabia, but the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait. All of them are opposed to Iran becoming a nuclear power. And I think we should take that into consideration to provide a balanced view about
I agree with all three of your points, and I'm not here defending the Iranian government. I'm trying to explain their point of view, which is very, very different. And I do hope that this audience is sophisticated enough to appreciate that difference. You're absolutely right on the mismanagement, the economic mismanagement. It's terrible, but Iran is facing a situation that it has not faced since the end of the Iran-Iraq war. In terms of its oil exports are now less than less than a million barrels a day, which is even lower than it was in 1991. Government revenues are going to be cut by $40–50 billion. You mentioned the Revolutionary Guards. Actually, the way the sanctions work, those with access to hard currency are making out like bandits because the currency, the real, is dropping like a stone. So if you have access to dollars, your dollars are now worth 25,000 reals to the dollar, where a year ago it was 10,000. So actually, once again, the sanctions, they are what they are, but they are, at this point, judging from my experience there, they are not hitting the targets that we want to hit, namely those in the regime. They're hurting ordinary people. Factories are laying off blue-collar workers because they can't get spare parts or materials from Europe. It's a very difficult situation. People are pooling resources in order to be able to buy food, and the poverty levels are increasing. So that's why I worry that we're going down the Iraq route with this country. You mentioned Morsi. Yes, absolutely. I was there. It was a huge humiliation for Iran. And they did not benefit from the non-one summit at all, really, because Morsi came, he stayed for 4 hours, and he blasted their policy on Syria. They're not in a good situation. The question is, do we try to corner them even more, or do we try to give them a face-saving way out of this so that we don't see another country, particularly not a country like Iran, with nuclear weapons?
Okay, please.
Albert McKemkin.
Speak louder, please.
Albert, my name is Albert McKemkin. The panelists mentioned Hezbollah and the Kurds. I wonder if you could add some comments regarding the potential for those two groups to further destabilize the situation in Syria and Iran.
And I'm not the only one who's, this is an original with me, but if anybody had predicted this civil war in Syria back in January of 2011, and you would have said 18 months later, this is what it's going to look like in Syria, and Lebanon is going to be relatively peaceful, we would all thought, you're high on something. So actually, Hezbollah realizes it's in a very precarious position. Barbara has mentioned that it was at the height of its glory in 2006 because it, quote, didn't lose. But now the Sunni-Shia divide has become so large that Hezbollah, for the most part, appears to be laying low. I'm not saying that they may not have some operatives in Syria who are helping with this or that aspect of trying to undermine the opposition, but I don't think it's going to be very effective if that's what they're doing. Hezbollah, I think, has always been much closer to Iran. Nasrallah said that his marjah is Khamenei, and I don't think the Hezbollahis are going to fall on their sword for Syria. They have enough weapons, they have enough of an arsenal, and I'm sure Iran is probably counseling them, you know, we have bigger plans for you should Israel attack. As far as the Kurds go, they seem to be, again, I'm not following this day to day, and there are probably people right in this room who know this much better than I, but the Barzanis have been counseling the Kurds in Syria not to let PKK become ascendant and provoke the Turks, because the Barzani, you know, people are making money. I defer to Ambassador Jeffries, but I was in Kurdistan. It looked pretty prosperous to me less than a year ago. And, you know, there's sort of, the Turks are investing in northern Iraq. And there's sort of, I don't want to say a honeymoon, but it's a modus vivendi. The Syrian Kurds are, I think, taking some of their guidance from the Barzanis. They're not looking right now for an independence movement. They're just looking to strengthen their position within Syria. They're not joining the opposition, and they're not helping the government. They're on the fence, but it's Turkey they better be worried about if they allow the PKK to use Kurdish-controlled territory to attack.
Okay.
Let me just say one thing on that. On Hezbollah, there is a dynamic, and it's a military dynamic at play here. If Syria falls out of the Iranian camp, much of Iran's military threat to Israel is in a wholly different place. Even if Hezbollah maintains its weapons and such, its ability to align itself with Syria, its ability to withstand an Israeli military strike, a conventional strike, is much reduced because it cannot assume that this whole Syrian army would mobilize along the Golan Heights, tying down much of the Israeli army, which is something that the Israelis had to worry about in 2006. And it goes on and on. Hezbollah would be much more cautious in serving as the main rocket-launching branch of Iran in a conflict with Israel than it is now because of this. So it is a game changer. Because it is a game changer, at some point Hezbollah might get more involved. There are a lot of examples of Hezbollah basically training elements, just as they are in Iraq, having been in Syria working with the government, but still the bulk of the Hezbollah movement obviously is not committed to Syria, but we'll see.
Okay. Dr. Hamid?
Tawfiq Hamid from the Potomac Institute for
Think louder, please.
Yeah, Tawfiq Hamid from the Potomac Institute. I just noticed that we have the real problem with the timing of the attack or doing any action that's fundamental to be done in a specific time. Like in Al-Qaeda, for example, was growing years ago, and we did not detect this threat. And when we started to detect it and we started to intervene, it was too late. My question is that with the Iranian threat, it's like if I'm a doctor and I see if I ignore the cancer at its very early stages, when it grows, it can metastasize and become very difficult to control. So when I see the Iranian threat here, I have one question. Is the time factor for our benefit or for the Iranian benefit? Can we deal with Iran after it will have nuclear capability and have this desire to erase Israel from the map? And we have not only Iran, we have the allies of Iran from Hamas, from Hezbollah, from other jihadist groups. So the problem here is not just the Iranian regime, but we have allies who believe in the concept of jihad and are ready to die for it, and they don't care for life. So are we really ready to deal with Iran after it, or how can we deal with it if we have all these troubles while we are still at this stage and Iran does not have nuclear weapon? So how will be the situation when they got the weapon, and it's time for their benefit or for our benefit? If we delay a serious intervention to stop the Iranians from getting new, then it's the delay. The more delay I see, the more the chance for the problem to be more complicated and the less our capability to deal with it.
Okay.
I think that we can deal with it before, during, and after. I mean, you know, Iran is not 80 feet tall. It's a country with a lot of problems. And you mentioned Hamas. Hamas is no longer allied with Iran. Hamas is now much closer to the Egyptians because of this Sunni-Shia divide, which is getting bigger and bigger and bigger all the time. I'm still not persuaded that Iran actually will build a weapon. If it were to do so, and somehow the U.S., despite what President Obama has said about preventing that, did not do anything against it, I still think it could be contained. If it were to develop nuclear weapons, then this sanctions regime, which I've complained about, would obviously be strengthened even more, and I think it would put enormous pressure on the country. We've actually seen, I mean, I've talked to people who say that it's possible really to almost completely eliminate Iran from exporting oil. I mean, already we've seen such drastic reductions, and the price hasn't gone that high because Iraq is increasing, and we have more oil, and the Saudis have been increasing. So I don't think the Iranians are in such a terribly strong position, and we should feel that we are operating from a position of strength when we deal with them.
Okay. General Gray, you want to make the final remarks, the last word? You know, I contain myself. I have many questions, but
Why don't you go ahead?
Can I just, with your permission, ask
Why don't you go ahead and
one
uncontain
question, not
yourself?
about Iran, about a humanitarian.
No, I think everybody's either hungry or tired or whatever. But on behalf of Mike Schweppin, our CEO and chairman and all, and myself and our board of regents, I want to thank the panel for I think a superb discussion on some very, very crucial issues. I think that, and thank all of you for coming. I think it's obvious and very clear, really, that there are no simple solutions to any of these challenges, and they're going to be with us for a long, long, long time. So in the national geostrategic sense, perhaps it would be wise for us to take the long view about all these kind of things, not just in the Mideast, but really elsewhere around the world, and ask ourselves some simple questions. What do we want things to look like 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years from now, from the standpoint of people and from the standpoint of all of our collective free world values, if you will, and what does that mean to everybody? Clearly, this has the potential, if it isn't already, a religious kind of a conflict, and so certainly there has to be an ecumenical thought process to all of this. And this is not necessarily Islamic kind of a challenge at all. There are many good Islamic people around the world and elsewhere and the like, but this has to be an ecumenical type of thought process that really leads us down the trail. The nuclear issue is, of course, of paramount interest to everybody, and really it's interesting. After the first Gulf War, when everybody was mesmerized with the so-called great attack and the awe, shock and awe, etc., 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 and everybody was patting themselves on the back for all this high technology. It's very interesting what the people in this part of the world thought about it. The Indian thought process was very clear. This means that you have to have a nuclear capability. That's what they said. And that's what many of the people in this part of the world thought about. And when you talk about the awesome threat of nuclear, biological, or chemical, or radiological type weapons and so on, you know, God forbid, but if they use these kind of weapons, they're going to threaten everybody in the region and halfway around the world. Nuclear weapons that may be used in Israel or in Iran, for example, is going to kill an awful lot of people in Central Asia, depending on where the winds are blowing and how that's working. So these are monumental type questions, and the idea of working these things out bilaterally, unilaterally, and elsewhere, and other ways, so no first use and things like that. What about the cyber threat and all those kind? These things have to be worked out diplomatically and all of that kind of thing, in my humble opinion. And we've got an awful lot on our plate right now, but I think the long view, and I think patience here, and all that kind of thing really is the way to go. Iran, for example, hasn't been the same since 1979. The Iranian people, they're victims of a lot of this, but it was Khomeini who really created the instability in that part of the world right now, and still, you know. So we ought to look at what he has done, and how do we counter what Khomeini had in mind with his world domination, all the other kind of things. These are tough issues, and you know about them better than I. But again, thank you all for coming, and we look forward to having another Yonah Alexander operation here very soon. We hope all of you can come. Thank you.